Joining us now on The Debate, the 5 finalists in the Charles Taylor Literary Prize, and they are, in alphabetical order: Stevie Cameron, author of On the Farm, Robert William Picton and the Tragic Story of Vancouver's Missing Women; Charles Foran, author of Mordecai, The Life and Times; Ross King, author of Defiant Spirits, The Modernist Revolution of the Group of Seven; George Shiposh, author of The Geography of Arrival, a memoir; and Marilee Weisbord, author of The Love Queen of Malabar, memoir of a friendship with Kamla Das. It is so good of all of you to come in again for what has become a bit of an annual tradition here on the agenda. We love to have the 5 nominated authors for the Charles Taylor Prize in. And as is our custom, we will start by just asking you about your books. So Stevie, what's your book about?
Well, my book is a lovely departure from crooked politicians. It's a serial killer. And
how far a departure is that?
Quite a ways.
Good.
Actually, it was a real relief, and I've loved this book. It's a story of how dozens and dozens of women were going missing from the downtown east side. The Vancouver police appeared not to care. People did care, but not the police, and it took a long time for them to accept the fact there was a serial killer in their midst. And so it's the story of who he is and how they found him and how they were able to miraculously identify the remains of dozens of women on his property.
Now, I know when you write a book, it essentially takes over your life when you write this book. And your topic is so awful and horrendous. I just wonder how you get up every day and deal with this horror day after day after day after day.
With huge enthusiasm. I loved it. It wasn't the horror, it was being in British Columbia, where I went to university. I loved that. The weather was good. I just felt like a kid again. I had an adventure. And I never felt that someone was going to try to fire my husband. I never felt that somebody was going to hurt one of my kids. I never felt that I was in any danger of being followed. I never felt that I was going to lose my job.
All of which are previous experiences for you.
Yeah, I do. I've had quite the time in this. And I love doing the books that I did. But to go from politicians to a serial killer was actually really fun. It was very moving. I've worked with homeless people in Toronto for 17 years in a church soup kitchen I started up, and I was used to the kind of issues that I would be dealing with in Vancouver, and it was exciting.
Okay. Charlie, tell us about Mordecai, Life and Times.
It's a biography of a little-known Canadian writer out of Montreal. Wrote a few books, smoked a few cigars.
Might have had a movie made about
Might have had a movie
one of his works
recently. Steve, that's right. It is a big book about a big life. It's a biography of Mordecai Richler, iconic Canadian author, public figure, beloved by most, not so beloved by some. Everybody had an opinion. He passed away 9 years ago, and I think everybody over the age of about 35 knows who I'm talking about.
Was this biography authorized by the family?
No, it was not. I wrote it with the cooperation of the family because I wanted the cooperation. The kind of book I wanted to write, I wanted it to be full of character. I wanted it to be full of his character, his appetites, his friends, his world. And if you don't have cooperation, you can wind up with one of those books that are, you speak to the friend of a friend of a friend. And I didn't have any interest in that. So I was only going to proceed if I had the cooperation principally of his widow, Florence Richler. But that in turn, of course, opened doors. And Florence cooperated. We got along. We spoke for 4 years. But at no point did she want the book to be authorized. At no point did she make any kinds of demands.
She never vetted the final copy,
for
example?
Not at all.
Okay.
No.
Do you come away from your experience, having spent these years with Mordecai, if you like, unambiguously liking him?
I ended up liking him more at the end than I did at the beginning. The arc of the book, for me as a writer, was discovering the private man. I only knew that private guy. Excuse me, I only knew that public man that everybody knew. Curmudgeonly a little bit, could be abrupt, could be tough-minded, smoking, drinking, an image. The private man I discovered over the course of interviewing more than 100 people substantially was a loving father, a loving and devoted husband, someone passionate about friends and friendship. Values I really like, so I ended up liking him more.
Do you worry, he's written a few good books in his time.
Yes, he has.
Do you worry about writing a book about him and how that will be compared to the stuff he's written?
I wouldn't want it compared. I wouldn't think it even would merit comparison. He was a great writer. I tried to write a good biography. Two different things. And at the same time, though, I suppose I had in mind prose of his quality. I aspired to fill my book, in a sense, with his sensibility. So yes, in that sense, there's a tiny bit of overlap, but I would never presume, Steve.
Gotcha. Ross, the group of 7. Tell us about yours.
Well, more Canadian icons, 7 of them plus 1 with Tom Thompson. And I think, like Charlie, I knew the public face of most of them. I certainly knew a lot of their paintings. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to look at them as people as well as painters, and to go behind the scenes, go into their studios, and look at the relationships between and among them. Because I think we've tended to see members of the group as sort of like I don't know, a Stanley Cup winning hockey team or something like that, where it's all for one and one for all. And it was a team effort. But what I wanted to do is look at them individually, sort of break it down and look at, for example, who Jackson was, what A.Y. Jackson's training was, and how he got on with Fred Varley, which was not very well. And just sort of try to separate them from the group entity that they became, and begin the story before they're a group, and look at them in 1912 when they're young, impoverished, insecure painters with a vision of Canada and a vision of painting, and then following them over the course of a dozen years until the mid-1920s, and just see where they ended up.
Now, if they'd done what they'd done in Europe or some parts of the United States, they would be massive superstar folk heroes that everybody in the country knew. Do you think that's the case in Canada?
It was the case, I think, in the 20s and 30s. And the thing I wanted to draw attention to at the end of the book is just how famous they were. In 1924, there was the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. All of the British colonies and dominions sent their trade representatives and examples of their trade products. But they also sent art, and so the group of 7, and Thompson's paintings, Thompson was dead by then for 7 years, but Thompson's paintings were a part of it. And they took London by storm. All of the top British art critics, experts on post-impressionism, celebrated them as the best group of landscape painters of the 20th century, comparing them favorably, or for example, saying that they were better than the French painters, Fauve painters, people like Matisse, Flamanc, Duran. And so they really did become international superstars in the 1920s. And so what I wanted to do was sort of rewind to that place where they weren't a group of young men who were sort of poo-pooed maybe in some areas of Canada or some areas of the artistic community, and look at what their contribution was to the nation as a whole.
And one more follow-up, but coming at it from a different point of view. We had Denis Reed, the former chief curator of the AGO, in this studio several months ago, and he said, you know, his chief love, I guess, and passion is Canadian art, and he said, you know, enough of the group of 7 already. There's a lot of other great Canadian art that isn't getting the attention it ought to because we're still so focused on the group of 7. Any issue with that?
Well, I would agree with him. And one of the things, I would not say enough of the group of 7, but I would want to say let's look at these other people. And I curate an exhibition in conjunction at the McMichael in conjunction with the book, and I brought in a lot of their contemporaries because I think the problem was the group became so preeminent and so well known, and their shadow was cast so long that a lot of people were eclipsed by it. And so I wanted to look at people like Florence McGillivray, who was a mentor for Tom Thompson and who greatly admired her, Peter Shepard, who was with Thompson, or with Harrison MacDonald at the very beginning of the story, J.W. Beatty. All of these people appear in the book and also appeared in the exhibition. And so I wanted to look at the group not simply as a group, but as part of a wider artistic community that was taking shape in Toronto, and then gradually spreading into Montreal, and then ultimately to Western Canada in the first couple of decades of the 20th century.
Great. George, a memoir. Tell us about it. Why'd you write it?
Well, it's a memoir of growing up in the 1950s and 1960s in southwestern Ontario, where I lived from the age of 7 when our family came to Canada as refugees from Eastern Europe till the age of 17 when we moved to Vancouver. So that covered that, basically the period of childhood.
You're from where originally?
From Budapest in Hungary, yeah.
Okay.
So the book started out as a fairly simple and fairly modest set of reminiscences tied to particular features of London, Ontario, certain neighborhoods, buildings, skating rinks, that sort of thing. But as it was written, it gradually became clear that that life that I had had, which was singularly unremarkable, nothing dramatic ever happened in it. But then that was, partly it was the character of the time. The 1950s coming after the war was a period in which Canadians were very anxious to be very, very ordinary, to have ordinary lives that were taken up with walking the dog and going skating, as opposed to the kind of privations that had been the case in the Depression and then the war years.
How does one get excited about writing? I mean, in some ways you want to be inspired and passionate and think of what you're doing as extraordinary, and yet you're trying to capture in your book the very ordinary. And I'm thinking London in the 1950s was very ordinary. How do you make that sing?
Well, when you look below the surface of ordinary lives, which God knows is the lives of most of us, particularly when we're children, things nevertheless happen to children. They form certain ideas, certain attitudes toward what knowledge is, what beauty is, what religion is, what our place in the world is. And as I reminisced about that ordinary childhood, it became clear that certain ideas that we then carry forward as adults nevertheless shape themselves around ordinary things. And in that sense, I hope that the book resonates with lots of people who did not grow up in 1950s London and did not come from overseas, but were nevertheless children who learn certain attitudes, certain conceptual frameworks from the ordinary aspects of life. So that it's still not dramatic, it still doesn't sing, but it resonates.
Resonates, good word. Were you influenced by Alice Munro?
Who in this country is not influenced by Alice Munro?
Okay. But how influenced by Alice Munro were you?
Not in the writing, and certainly not at the time. Yeah.
Okay, let me try this. Budapest, one of the great historic, amazing cities of the world. London, Ontario, 1950s. Not. What kind of transition was that like?
Well, I was 7 years old, and so not particularly aware of what Budapest was all about. And I think for children of that age, what is at the forefront of consciousness is not these large questions of cultural identity, questions of geographical placement, but things like, what is it like to go to a skating rink, and at a certain age to long for girls with ponytails and toques and mittens that place their feet just so as they skate. I mean, that is very ordinary, and yet you contemplate that from the perspective of a 60-year-old and say, so my attitudes toward what is charming, what is beautiful, what is female, what is feminine, had some origin going around counterclockwise in those skating rinks while the Blue Danube was playing out of scratchy loudspeakers. And so, in a sense, if the book has interest for the reader, I think it's in that we all formed our very basic values and basic conceptions from those strange experiences in a particular place in a particular time.
Neat. Marilee, tell us about The Love Queen of Malabar.
It's a book that I wrote in order to take a journey, and it was an incredible journey for me across cultures. What happened was my kids were growing up, and my husband was working all the time.
Where's this?
In Montreal,
okay.
And I wanted to travel. I wanted to write about it and travel. So I found a file on Kerala, which is on the southwest of India, and there I found the work of Kamla, who is arguably the greatest love poet in contemporary India. She died last year. And I got into contact with her, and she said, come visit me. And
got to stop you there. How did you come into contact with her?
I was supervising the work of a woman who is making development films, and she was in Kerala. I said, go see Kamla, ask if I can visit. And Kamla's husband had just died. She said, come. So I went, and that was the beginning of a 10-year, increasingly intimate friendship that brought me into an amazing other culture and brought Kamla into my life too. And through that I learned a lot and had many adventures.
Like what? What did you learn?
I learned that you can't take anything for granted about another culture that you don't know anything about. I learned that our culture is not as simple as one might expect. For example, free love has its, you pay for that. Kamla showed me that. My relationship with the person I was living with was not, there were insecurities in it that I wouldn't face, but because she was so keen on marriage, I faced. But it was an adventure. The whole thing was an adventure in terms of going somewhere I'd never been before. And I think that that's what people like about the book, because they come along with me to Southwest India, to Kerala, to Cochin, into the life of a Nair woman, a woman from the Nair caste, matrilineal, a great poet who first wrote about female desire, the first Hindu woman to ever write about female desire, who was attacked and yet is very conventional in many ways. So you get a sense of how complex people are and how we have to be humble in the face of other cultures.
I get the sense, just listening to you talk about her, that even though she is no longer physically on this earth, she is very much still inside of you. Is that right?
Yes. She's, and I think that she's very, people tell me that when they read the book, somebody just said to me that they go to bed beside me and Kamla. So I think they're very much inside Kamla's life too. And I don't know what to say except that the way I wrote it, I had hours and hours of transcripts because I recorded from the moment we met. I recorded. I kept journals. I had absolutely so much material. And at the beginning, I wanted to make the book just about her. But then people said, "You have to be a guide. You have to take us through the material." And that's what I think has ended up happening, is that you go with us through increasing intimacy and also through the drama, because at age 67, Kamla Das, an upper-class Orthodox Hindu woman, converts to Islam for love. And then all hell breaks loose with death threats, and from both sides, actually. And the drama of communal life in India becomes very real to me and to her. Well, she always knew about it, but to me.
I suspect you have all told us just enough about your 5 books to prompt our viewers to want to go out and sample them further, which they're welcome to do, of course. But with your 5 books, you paint quite a nice picture about this country of ours, and that's where I want to go next. We have 2 icons, Richler and a Group of 7. We have An Immigrant's Tale. These are very Canadian stories. We have Canada's increasing connection with the wider world, and Epic Crime. Now, if your 5 books are considered the best literary nonfiction that this country has to offer right now, I want to know what it says about us. Go ahead, Stevie. What does it say about us?
Epic Crime?
Just, you know, the panoply of issues that all 5 of you are dealing with. What does it say about Canada at this point in its history in the 21st century?
Steve, that's a very big question.
It is. That's what we do here on this program. We ask the big questions.
I know you do, but I mean, I think the range of subjects that we're covering are astonishing, and they're fun. And I haven't read anybody else's book, and I can't wait to go and read each one of these 4 books.
Me too.
I really am looking forward to this. And but you know, I'll talk about Epic Crime if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is that all right? Okay, because it is. In a way, my experience, when I hear Marilee talking about what she went through with this, mine was very similar, because I found worlds opening to me. And I'd never done a court case before, because the people I wrote about never got charged or tried, or So this guy, so it's fascinating. I learned how the police work. I learned about social workers and about the women on the street, and I learned how loving they were. I learned about how people who are at the bottom of our society are loved and do love, and are loved by many and do love many, and are missed. And I also learned how much people cared when you thought nobody cared. Everybody cared.
Well, let me follow up on that. How much do we care or love our icons in this country, based on your having lived with Mordecai Richler's story now for several years?
Not enough. We remain a largely mentally colonized country.
Mentally colonized? What do you mean by that?
We remain only partly inhabitants of our own space. Most people in Canada, has been my experience, are proxy Americans still. These are the same issues that concerned Canadian cultural nationalists in the 50s and 60s when Richler was emerging. I don't think anything has changed in that regard. I don't think we've grown particularly as a society, or evolved in that regard. But we've evolved in all sorts of other ways. We are increasingly diverse and full of the planet. The planet is here. But as for an identity which would, a single or even just a couple of identities that would allow us to recognize, celebrate our icons, I don't think we're anywhere near there.
Marilee, you want to have a go at that?
Well, it's just that I was amazed at the star status of Kamla in India. Thousands would come to hear her speak when she spoke. She was constantly in the news. The first time I met her, we got into her car and there were journalists running beside the car trying to talk to her. She was always treated free to any meals, any restaurant she went to. She was just a star, and it was because she was a great poet and short story writer in Malayalam. So it was so different. I was amazed. That was the first thing when I met her, that this absolute celebrity status that was accorded to her because of her writing.
Charlie?
I was going to offer an anecdote, Steve. I had the pleasure of doing my first ever signing at a Costco before Christmas. And as you know, the cover of the book doesn't have a name on it. And Knopf, my publisher, decided that for a certain kind of Canadian, they didn't want to be told. You didn't need to be told who that famous face belongs to. So I was sitting in Costco, and there were piles of the book in front of me, and I would, just for fun, because there was time to pass, I said, "Who is this? Who is this?" And a shocking number thought it was some very disheveled version of myself. I'd say 50% of people didn't know who Mordecai Richler was.
And you inferred from that what?
I took away from that they've never read him. They've never read him in a newspaper. They never read him in a magazine. They never read his books. They never saw his face, which was, to a culture Canadian, virtually ubiquitous for about 30 years. It was arguably one of the 2 or 3 most famous literary faces in our country, and they still didn't know.
But if it were, okay, he's been dead almost a decade, right?
Right.
So if it were a picture of Pierre Trudeau, who's been dead a decade,
everyone would know.
you think everybody would know?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
I
Go
just
ahead,
want
Mary.
to say one thing, which is that Kamla once said that the worst thing you can do to writers is give them a prize. And I wonder what this group thinks.
Okay, Ross, you wrote about icons,
Yes,
I should say.
well,
how
the
do you
interesting
view
thing
this?
about your question is, if we were here 95 years ago with Jackson and MacDonald and Lisburn, people like that, they would have been having exactly the same conversation, because that was the question they kept addressing. There was an artistic brain drain in Canada at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. And I think a great cautionary tale for them was the example of David Milne. I mean, there were many of them, but David Milne was virtually the same. He was exactly the same generation, a couple of years younger than Thompson, a couple of years older than Jackson, and born in Ontario, 20 miles away from where Tom Thompson was born. And there were no opportunities for him at all. And he went to New York and became extremely well known in New York City, and then later in Europe, and exhibited, one of 3 Canadians, at the Armory Show in New York, the great show of modernist art. And Milne then, after the war, after World War I, came back to Canada, came to Toronto, and wanted to live here and make his way in the world here. No one knew who he was. He looked around, there weren't any dealers who would take his work on. And he went back to New York and really stayed there for the next 20 years.
Do you suspect more people know who Robert Pickton is than know who A.Y. Jackson is or Lauren Harris?
Well, one of the things I've done over the past couple of years, I've traveled around Toronto, or traveled not only in Toronto, but across Canada, is asked people, say, what are you doing? And I say, I'm writing a book in the group of 7. And then I say, how many can you name? And they say, a lot of them say Tom Thompson. And I say, well,
technically,
yes, honorable mention for that guess. But people can name A.Y. Jackson, most people, but virtually no one could name all of them. And it's maybe not important to know all of them individually, but I think to know what they were trying to do as a group entity. And later in life, Jackson complained, I think by the late 50s, he said, we're seeing an example of nationalism in a backward country, which maybe he was very depressed about this because the world had moved on, he felt. But I think the urgency and the cogency of what they were trying to do is emphasized by the fact that almost 100 years later, we're still saying, you know, who are we as Canadians? What unites us? What do we have in common? What are the differences? How can we bridge those? And what does it mean to be a Canadian? And those were exactly the things that they were wrestling with around the time of World War I.
George, haven't heard you yet on this.
Well, for obvious reasons, that I'm certainly, as the subject of the memoir, not an iconic Canadian by any stretch of the imagination.
Not yet, George.
Yeah, right. When we think about Canadians, though, and it's certainly true that we have had at various times in our history people who we admire in one way or another. I mean, Johnny Bauer and Frank Mahovlich, when I was a kid, were probably more iconic to me than Mordecai Richler. But at the same time, the lives of ordinary people go on and happen and have a certain course and assume a certain flavor from the country and the time they live in. So to be a Canadian, both now and 50 years ago, had a quality and a character that was taken from the assumptions of the time, the institutions of the time, the history of our country at the time. And there were millions of us being Canadians, living ordinary lives, playing hockey on Saturdays, going to church on Sundays, doing whatever those things were that characterized us in the 50s. And so that's what my book tries to kind of capture in the case of one particular product of that time.
Let me put one more phenomenon on the table here, and our thanks to Wikipedia for this quote. Sorry to fess up to that, but here's the Garrison Mentality, which has been referred to in the literary past of this country. And let's put this up if we can, Michael. Characters are always looking outwards and building metaphorical walls against the outside world. This mentality is assumed to come from part of the Canadian identity that fears the emptiness of the Canadian landscape and fears the oppressiveness of other nations, especially the U.S. The term was first coined by literary critic Northrop Frye and further explored by author Margaret Atwood. Now that's there. That's been a part of our, part of our reality, I guess, for a long time. Charlie, you first. Do you see your work reflected in that mentality?
My work as a novelist or as a biographer?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, true. That was referring to fiction, I guess, more, but sure, as a biographer, why not?
Mordecai Richler's relationship with that ethos is interesting because he was once born and raised Montrealer. He declared very early on in his life that he was a Canadian. He said, all my attitudes are Canadian, there's nothing to be done about it. And yet he lived 20 years in London and was a relentless and persistent critic of Canada and was internationally minded, looked more to New York and London for models, and was very comfortable with all that. He was very comfortable. He didn't feel any need to adhere to any single position on what it was to be a Canadian or to be a Canadian writer or to be a Canadian intellectual. He just was. And if there's anything he served as a model of, it was of, in a sense, the Canadian artist just saying, all right, this is the landscape. It's simultaneously indifferent, empty, if you will, to use their, or marginally filled with people who may or may not be interested in what I'm doing. So I'm just going to carry on and assume that the whole world is my subject, in a sense, or my audience.
Ross, do you think the Garrison mentality was a part of the group of Seven's life?
Part of that mentality holds up because the palisades they wanted to put up were against the American influence, the French, the British. They wanted to close themselves off from that. Although one of the things that I discuss in the book is the way in which any comment they made about the art of Europe or the art of America is very disingenuous, because most of them had studied in Europe. A.Y. Jackson spent many years there gormandizing on art in Paris and London. And so they were well versed in European forms of art and post-impressionism especially. But the other part of the Garrison, I think they wanted to break down, and they wanted to go out into, obviously when we think of Group of Seven art, we think of Northern Ontario, Algonquin, Georgian Bay, places like that. And so they wanted to go out into this world that I think Canadians had seen as maybe forbidding or empty, or not worth caring about, and certainly not worth painting. And they thought this is the essence of Canada, this sort of wild northern landscape. It makes us who we are. It's in our economic lifeblood, but it's also part of our DNA. Right. And so I think they were very concerned about exploiting that part of Canada for artistic purposes.
Milne, you see any of yourself reflected in that comment?
Not much.
No?
I've got to say.
Would Kamla have seen any of that reflected based on her relationship or knowledge of Canada through you?
No, she did say one interesting thing, which is that for Canadians, nature is our spirituality.
Okay.
But Garrison Mentality, no, she was definitely open to the world. She thought all writers should be.
Well, she's not Canadian.
Yeah, but I think that the fact that I wrote this book, which was absolutely an attempt to enter into and be entered by another, to know another culture and to have another person from another culture know me. And I think so many of our writers now are from other places, and some are great and acclaimed writers.
Okay, but you say you're not influenced by this, and yet to find the subject of your life that you wanted to devote yourself to writing about, you went 8,000 miles away. So, does this not, I mean, you needed to find inspiration away from Canada.
Well, I think the inspiration to find inspiration away from Canada was within me.
Okay, you got me there. Okay, you got me there.
I've got to say that I'm not a great fan of landscape Canadian writing. And I find that many of my writer friends aren't either. So I think that the new generation is not going to be writing about the, extremely about the flowers that grow in our backyards, or there are other concerns, and those other concerns are way more open to the world.
Stevie, does this impact on you at all, this notion?
No, it doesn't. I'm sort of a weird fit in this particular circle, because I've written about politics, and now I've written about violent crime, and so I don't know. But I'm half American, and I was brought up mostly, well, I was brought up all over the world, but I come from I come from Belleville, Ontario.
But, so what half you, when you say you're half American?
My father was an American pilot who fought in the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
And
I don't think I knew that. Okay.
No, you didn't. And he was very famous. And he was, so we lived in South America, we lived in Hollywood, we lived in Zurich, where he was arrested one night, and I've written a little bit about that. And, but to me, I had a wonderful big family in Belleville.
What the heck were you doing in Belleville, Ontario, if your father was such a citizen of the world?
Well, my grandparents lived there. My family came from there, going back many generations. Okay. But there was an Air Force base there, much known because of Russell Williams, another famous serial killer here in Canada, because he was the commandant of the base. But my father, after he left Spain, came back to Canada, and where he'd been a friend of Hemingway's. Hemingway wrote stories about him. I mean, it was a very interesting group. Anyway, my father came back and joined the Canadian Air Force. He was an American combat pilot. And he met my mother at the country club. So it was a very mixed group, and so I spent a lot of my life abroad. And but to me, Belleville, and then when I went to university in Vancouver, they became the best worlds in the world for me. I just thought this was so great.
How could you not love growing up on the banks of the Moira River, after all?
Well, the mighty Moira.
The mighty Moira.
I loved. It was a secure haven for me from the catastrophes of our lives in other countries. So and
now you've spent your life writing about the catastrophes of this country.
I love this country, and I don't feel Garrison mentality at all. I think.
Okay. Okay, Charlie, follow up.
Just quickly, Mordecai Richard's son Noah Richard wrote a book about geography and Canadian writing, and he said something very smart about those empty spaces. He said, they weren't really empty. We just didn't know the people who lived there. And at the same time, though, and this is almost to contradict my earlier observation about Mordecai Richard, he though he was this international-minded Jewish Montrealer, urban writer about urban experiences, he was fascinated by the North. And he went up there many times, and he wound up writing, I think, his greatest novel, Solomon Gursky Was Here, has a strong northern component. It's undermined by his mischief and his satire. You know, he has a Hasidic Jew stowaway in the Franklin expedition and survived because he brings his own kosher food. Nevertheless, though, he was, in a sense, he felt the need, like a lot of Canadians of his generation, to experience that other Canada, which was empty, as we understood it then. Though, as his own son correctly reassessed, it wasn't empty, it isn't empty, we just didn't know it was there.
You know, as long as we're doing connections with his kids, you know, in this very spot that we are having this discussion right now, his son Daniel hosted Imprint for many, many years, probably 5 or 6 redesigned incarnations of this set ago.
Right, a very talented family.
And one of the first guys I met here, and was actually a wonderful friend in bringing me from CBC to TVO. Raved about this place, so that's my little connection to the Ritzlers. Let me talk about, I've had this discussion with other writers in the past, and I may be being a bit semantic here, but I would be interested in your take on this. George, to you first. Are you a Canadian writer, or are you a writer who happens to be Canadian?
Glad you're first, George.
Can I say yes to both?
If you can explain why you say yes to both.
Sure. Well, on the one hand, writing is writing, and it has no national boundaries. You construct, hopefully, beautiful structures of words that anybody who can read in English can read and appreciate for its formal beauties. So in that sense, writers are writers. At the same time, it's certainly true that everything I've written, I'm principally a poet, is somehow rooted in the particulars of the Canadian landscape and the particulars of the world that I inhabit and that I'm familiar with. So in that sense, yes, of course, my writing is completely different than if I were living in Portugal. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, yes, I'm a Canadian writer. But I think we want to be a little careful of these fairly artificial distinctions. All writers write from who they are and their geographical, social, cultural sphere, but their purpose for writing is not simply to illustrate that. Their purpose for writing is to create books, to create texts that have an internal consistency, an internal capacity for enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it.
I'll tell you why I ask, and Marilyn, you get to go next on this one, and that is, we had an author in here not too long ago named Shima Khan, who wrote a book about, she's a Muslim woman who wears the hijab and loves hockey. And her kids are all into hockey. And she wrote a book, and I'm going to botch the title here, but it was something like, you know, Reflections on Hockey by a Canadian Muslim. And I asked her, why'd you call it a Canadian Muslim instead of a Muslim Canadian? You know, is the Canadian your modifier, but you really are a Muslim first and foremost, or are you a Canadian first and foremost who happens to be? Okay, so this is why I'm asking the question. Are you a Canadian writer, or are you a writer who happens to be a Canuck?
I find it a really confusing question.
That's not the first time I've heard that said about me, but anyway, go ahead.
I've not thought, actually, it's an interesting question. You know, there are so many different kinds of Canadians, so that as Stevie said, I love this country. This is a wonderful country. On the other hand, I know about its repressions, because my parents were left-wing people in the 30s. I know things about this country, about its law and order history, about certain aspects of it that are not perfect. But as far as countries in the world, it's wonderful, and I'm so glad to be part of it. However, my being a Canadian is very different from many other people's being a Canadian, because I was brought up to believe in the brotherhood of man, not to go to church. I was brought up to believe that you can fight for the underdog, that you had to fight for the underdog. There's a whole past that I have that's an internationalist past. So that's part of my Canadianism.
Just to complete the circle here, and Shima will probably appreciate how I do this. Thank you, Control Room, for getting into my ear. The book is called Of Hockey and Hijab, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman. So we got that on the record as well. Stevie, how about you? You a Canadian writer or a writer who happens to be Canadian?
I'm a writer who happens to be Canadian. Although all my subjects have basically been Canadian, but I'm a writer, you know, and I'm fortunate to live in this country and fortunate to have great publishers, but sometimes I long to write books about other countries and other places.
Is that next?
Well, I've lived in a lot of countries, and even as an adult, I've lived in Israel, and I've got a book planned there, and I've lived in England, and I've got a book planned there. And I just keep on writing these Canadian stories.
They're pretty interesting, aren't they?
They are fascinating.
They are. Let's, can I go to, oh, we're almost on a wide shot. Michael, can you take a wide shot so we can see everybody here? Because I want to get a show of hands here. You all know social media is the rave here, right? Hands up, how many people are on Facebook here? 1, 2. 2 of you. How many of you tweet? Hands up. None of you tweet. Okay, this is fascinating because, you know, I know you've all written books in black and white that are bound and, you know, killed trees to make and all of this kind of stuff. But we are also told that the future is in e-readers, and there are some authors nowadays who are pumping out books 140 characters at a time on Twitter.
Books?
What do we think?
Books?
Discuss. Charlie, go.
Well, personally, I seem to prefer to wait until a new technology toy is outdated, and then I get into it.
Okay.
So I like to stay about a generation behind. And the generation now seems to be somewhere between 12 and 18 months. So it's very rapid. And
Margaret Atwood tweets.
She tweets very effectively. I happened to be at a conference for International Pen in Tokyo last September, and representing Pen Canada, and our office staff person emailed me and said, Margaret Atwood is tweeting from the conference, you have to too. And I thought, okay, Margaret Atwood is tweeting. So I did tweet then, Steve, to be perfectly honest. You know, I'm not saying this stuff is ephemera, but it sure feels that way to me.
Okay. Ross, what do you say?
This is not a good question for me. I don't even have a website. And my first fear was realized when my worst fear was realized when maybe a year or 2 years ago. I never Google myself. I mean, I think that's fatal for an author's self-confidence. But I did look to see if I was on Wikipedia. And for a long time, whenever my name came up on Wikipedia, on other things I was looking at, I hasten to add, it would be in red, which meant there's nothing on this guy. We've got nothing on him. And then suddenly, one day there was a hyperlink, and you could go to the Ross King article on Wikipedia, and I thought, oh my God. I'm just very, very private, which is odd insofar as I write about people's lives. I mean, essentially, I'm a historical biographer, and so I love letters, anything, laundry lists that I can get from any of these people.
But your privacy desires notwithstanding, you all have publishers who are no doubt saying, publicize. You got to get out there, you got to tweet, you got to create communities, you got to get the word out, right?
My publisher told me I had to get on Facebook. So I got on Facebook. I don't like Facebook.
You don't like it?
No, I don't.
But it's sort of an evil necessity if you want to be in the
Well, the people on it
world.
are so nice, and I now think I have about 400 friends. And they're lovely. They care about I can see the addiction growing because they sort of care about each other and they care about me and they're interested, and I'm connecting with all kinds of people. Sometimes you don't want to do that.
You know, this great writer Amitav Ghosh once said to me, I said to him, are you on Facebook? And he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, well, why should I? And I said, because you'd be more connected. And he said, why would I want to be more connected? So
to sell more books?
I mean, Russell Smith said it doesn't sell more books, didn't he, in his column in the Globe?
There is a sense, and incorrect or not, that again, because of such the rapidity of change, newness replacing newness, newest, that these strategies for selling books are not so sure anymore. The publishers are, needless to say, in disarray and trying to respond constantly. Just an hour ago, a publisher told me that they now think half their sales might be ebooks within 2 years. So naturally, you're right. That ought to trigger are responding differently to the way people are reading, because they're no longer reading us apparently between covers. They're reading us on an e-reader. I guess some of us are being a little slow to respond because it doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't feel quite real.
Okay.
I'm not slow to respond at all in a way. I mean, I have an iPad, it's with me, and I have books downloaded on it, and I don't like actually reading the books on it. I thought I would love it. I love it for every other thing that it does, and it does them brilliantly, but books, I just don't like reading on.
It's hard to mark up a e-reader, isn't it?
Well,
hard to make notes in the margin.
Oh, I had to laugh. I had to do something in the paper about this the other day. So I said, you know, when you're lying in bed, you turn like this, and the thing keeps turning. And some impatient person said, "Don't you know that you can lock it in place?" You know. And so now I'm trying to figure out how to lock
it in place.
Yeah.
But okay, this raises the issue of, and this may be a bit too far out in left field, but let's give it a whirl anyway. When you, George, you first, when you imagine somebody picking up your book and reading your book, snuggling up by the fire on the couch to read your book, who is that person? What does that person look like? What ethnic background are they from? What demographic group do they represent? Do you think about that?
No.
Because we're talking about...
Because arrogantly I assume that everybody will love my book. I mean, it's not aimed at a particular... Now, having said that, I assume that the person who's going to read my book will be older rather than younger, simply because of the nature of the enterprise of it, of an older person reminiscing and in an analytic way about childhood, which I suspect is not going to be particularly appealing to adolescents. But having said that, despite the fact that the book is about a family that immigrated to Canada from Europe, I don't see the audience particularly being former immigrants.
Okay,
or
Charlie,
whatever.
what do you see?
Certainly for Mordecai Richter's biography, I do see older readers. I see readers who are implicated or in the story, for whom this story is their story too. And I've received wonderful emails from readers saying that they were very moved by not just his life, but by the evocation of that Canada, because his life, in a sense, covers the arc of the emergence of Canada as a nation in some respects.
I don't mean to be stereotypical about this, but you've got to figure your book would be huge in the Montreal Jewish community, right?
I've had some wonderful events. The events I've enjoyed most have been talking to older Jews up in Montreal, yeah, because it's very lively people, and they are really, really involved. So,
how about yours? You think about who's reading it?
Yeah, I do. I think all ages, not children, but you know, I know that teens and younger people are very interested in this because they're interested in crime. But I think. No, I don't see one reader.
Okay.
Whereas I did with the political books, but
Sure.
not with this one.
Sure. Marilee, how about yours?
You know, I thought it would be women and of a certain age, but I'm finding that young women love it, and to my great surprise, I'm finding that men like it. And the only thing I can think about is that they're just shock and awe at being close to such intimate conversations between women.
Or they're trying to suck up to their wives.
No.
It.
Read John Barber's review in the Globe. No, they really like it.
Okay, Ross, what do you say?
Well, I've been fortunate over the last 10 or 15 years to meet a lot of my readers at book signings or talks I've given and things like that. And I'm happy to say, and so just not shallow tweeting virtual relationships, actual hand-to-hand contact and eyeball-to-eyeball contact. I'm happy to say I have students, I have older people, everyone in between. So I think I seem to have a reasonably broad cross-section. But I do have a story where most interviews I've done, the interviewer's always been very nice, but I had a very hostile one time, and she said to me, "You're just must only be men who read your books." And I said, "Well, why? How do you come to that assumption?" And she said, "Because there are explosions in all of your books." And I mean, I can't help it. There are explosions in history, and it is true that I've written a couple of books since then, and there are still explosions. And so I went away thinking about that and wondering that am I just writing for a male population who likes explosions?
Are there any?
It seemed very small.
I should ask Ross. Are there any explosions in your book about the Group of Seven?
One that nearly killed A.Y. Jackson.
Oh, there you go. All right. All right.
World War I.
How am I doing on time here? What do we got left? 3 minutes. Okay, let's do about
but
30.
Let me just say, Steve, after this, I went to a book signing, and 75% of the people coming up we're female, so
Here, here.
females like explosions as well.
They do. Okay, 30 seconds left to each of you here. I want to know what kind of impact you want your books to make in the long run. Stevie, what are you hoping for?
I'm hoping that people will understand from my book how people get addicted, what it takes to make their lives better, and how justice works.
Ross, what kind of impact, long range, would you like to make?
Well, I would like people to take away from the example of the group the idea that we can, in Canada, create art, create culture that can stand on its own 2 feet, and more important than that, can stand comparison with the Americans, with the British, with the French, with whomever, and that we have talented people here if only we nurture them and that we give them the opportunity.
Marilee.
I'd like people to have less hubris about their own societies or cultures, and not judge people by stereotypical, external or propagandistic values, but really understand that it takes a while to know and to have compassion and closeness to another culture.
George.
I would be very happy if people, having read my book, came to realize that meaning and significance and large human questions reside in very ordinary lives.
Okay, Charlie, you're batting cleanup here.
I'd like people to enjoy an experience of a big, rich Canadian life, a big, rich, complex Canadian personality, and then I want them to go and read Mordecai Richler's books.
Yours first, though.
Yes.
Read yours first and then theirs.
I like the order. That's a good order.
You like the order. You know, everybody wants me to ask you this question. Have you seen Barney's version yet?
Yes, I have.
You probably get asked that a 1,000 times
Surprising number of interviews start that way.
a day. Well, aren't you pleased I left it to the very end?
I am.
Okay, and?
It's a terrific film.
It's
a terrific film.
That's it?
Oh, I thought we were short on time.
No, that's all right. You're right. You're not a film reviewer. I should leave it there. Can I thank all of you for coming in tonight? What a great discussion this was. A wonderful tradition we've established here at TVO, and we're so glad that you 5 nominated candidates, let's call you that, authors, whatever, for the Charles Taylor Prize for Literary Nonfiction are here. Starting with Stevie Cameron, On the Farm, Robert William Picton and the Tragic Story of Vancouver's Missing Women, Ross King, Defiant Spirits, The Modernist Revolution of the Group of Seven, Marilee Wisborne, The Love Queen of Malabar, Memoir of a Friendship with Kamla Das, George Shipos, The Geography of Arrival, a Memoir, and Charlie Foran, Mordecai, The Life and Times. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.